bevo.com.
A business leader that is used to being in front of cameras, the lights and the action, Doug Richard, one of the early dragons and the founder of the School for Startups. Doug, welcome to Bevo.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Doug, it's well known that smart people like to hang out with other smart people. So as a dragon, is there anything that you learned from the other dragons in business and leadership?
I like your predicate that smart people like to hang out with smart people, and therefore we dragons therefore should all like each other. That would presume a great deal, doesn't it? Yeah, some of the dragons are smart people. I agree completely. What did I learn from other dragons? I have a great deal of time and respect for Theo. He's one of the great turnaround artists of the 20th and 21st century. And he has a skill at identifying undervalued assets, i.e. seeing things that most people wouldn't see value in and restoring or extracting that value. Whereas since the kind of money I've made has always been from starting something from nothing and just growing it, I find it very puzzling how he sees in rubbish gold.
Doug, because there's a big difference though, isn't there, between a great entrepreneur and a typical turnaround manager?
Comprehensively. Yeah, I've done one turnaround, and that was one too many in my life. Yeah, it doesn't suit me at all. It takes a different personality. It takes a different approach. You've got to enjoy the pain and struggle of a lot of people who are going to be very dissatisfied with you and have a great deal of tenure. I'm very impatient. I specialize in having ADD. There's no way I enjoy turnarounds.
Doug, what advice would you give to somebody watching this that are going to make their first angel investment, that want to make sure they get a return on their children's inheritance, as your friend Theo likes to put it?
I think many people who are angel investors misunderstand the nature of angel investing. They think it's part of a continuum of investing where they are a preceding stage to a later stage of investment. Therefore, most angels are under the misunderstanding that they think that they're going to make money by putting money in early, getting a larger share of equity, and that then they'll go on to later stages of funding like venture. As a rule, angels who invest prior to venture capitalists lose all their money. You got to remember this is a really important point because losing money sucks. The reason they lose their money is because the later stage rules. It's the last stage of investment that makes all the decisions and decides who gets what. Therefore, as a rule, the best way to make money as an angel investor is to make sure that the kind of capital you're putting in is adequate to see the company to profitability. Thus, the best angel investments are very, very small businesses that grow to be small businesses or occasionally grow slightly larger, but do so on modest capital requirements, not companies that then go on to need a lot of capital.
Doug, whether you're going to invest in a small business or an early stage or medium size, I understand it's very important to have scale. So what exactly is scale from the investment perspective?
I think anybody who angel invests shouldn't look for the next Google, as there's only been one. Thus, looking for the next one is much like looking for winning the lottery. I think as for your larger question, how do you look for disruptive innovation rather than lifestyle businesses? I think what you're really doing is using words that are a proxy for finding businesses that scale versus those that do not, or actually have the opportunity to scale. And scale itself is to some degree a proxy, a metaphor for even something much more basic, and that is that your revenues grow not in sync with your costs. Bottom line, it's as simple as that. You have to have more revenue, your revenue has to grow on some scale, arithmetic, exponential, something geometric greater than a linear cost scale and cost. Because if they grow hand in hand, then you're never going to get scale because you always have to have more working capital.
Whether you call it agile, opportunistic, or just simply following the money, I think that those are a very important attribute of winning organizations these days. So can you give us an example of a large organization that moves fast and is agile and nimble?
I dislike metaphors because they mean whatever we choose them to mean. So agile is a nice way of saying it. Some people would use the term opportunist as a not nice way of saying the same thing. What you're essentially implying is quick, right? Fast to respond. Well, sometimes it's good to respond quickly because opportunities go away, and it's nice to be the first in a new market, and it's nice to have products that stay current. So companies like Zara, for example, which have an integrated production manufacturing chain behind a retail store, have used being quick as a key USP, differentiator, because they can find a trend in the marketplace and take that design and put it into manufacturing and have clothing back on the street in weeks. Therefore, they've institutionalized speed as an advantage in the marketplace. That's a large corporation that is producing clothing manufactured in Europe. And a lot of people are under the misunderstanding that all clothing is manufactured in China. So obviously, speed mattered more than location of manufacturing. So yes, speed's very, very useful if it's employed to create a differentiated advantage.
Some entrepreneurs write business plans and then they do whatever it takes to get to the business plan objective, whereas in actual fact maybe they should just be following what the marketplace need is once they're in the marketplace.
There's a famous saying in Silicon Valley, it's always plan B, right? So I have never yet started a company, and I've started quite a few now, where whatever plan I had when I started it is how I made my money. I have always made my money some other way. And I think that is inherently the case because until the business is going, you're not actually talking to a customer. You're not actually in the marketplace. You're not actually dealing with partners. And it's those pressures on your idea that actually shape the product into a profitable, differentiated, sustainable, competitive product or service. In theory, you can make up anything you like. All products are perfect until they ship, right? The reason they call it Plan B in Silicon Valley is because many, many startups have started with a very specific intent and ended up doing something entirely different. And in fact, I would assert that many startups that you think of today were aiming left and turned right, and you just never knew they had that first story because they don't tell that story.
I've got a friend of mine over in Silicon Valley, he's in private equity, and he says it's better to invest in a great management team and smart people than it is in a great product. Well, obviously, ideally you would want both, but if you're going to choose one over the other, then it's better to have the smart person on the premise that the smart person can identify where the marketplace shifts, whereas if you've just got a product, it's got a shelf life.
In large part. I mean, the earlier stage of the business, the more you're investing in the person because the less else there is to invest in. Yeah. At seed stage, when somebody's starting a company, everything else is fictional. It's a lie, it's a story. There is no profit, there is no revenue, there is no product, there is no service. There's just some guy or woman standing in front of you telling you what's going to be, right? They're storytellers. So you are inherently investing in a person, whether you think you are or not.
Doug, you talk about the art of storytelling being very important, whether you're about to communicate as a CEO or communicate why your product and service is a disruptive innovator. So can you tell us why that is so important as a skill for a leader?
All great entrepreneurs are great storytellers. If you think about what it takes to do disruptive innovation, you're basically saying, I'm going to change the way you understand the world and tell you you're going to do things very differently. So what is the art of storytelling? It's essentially saying to somebody, come along with me on a journey, engage with me, even though, choose to ignore reality all around you, and we're going to go on this journey and everything's going to work out, right? That's what starting a business is all about, especially with disruptive innovation. You're basically saying, suspend your disbelief. It's the heart of innovative companies. And you will disbelieve, right? At the end of the day, if I had told you that all phone calls would be free, or if I told you that you would have, a heads-up display in front of you as you walk down the street, well, you will. In fact, it's called amplified reality, augmented reality. It's coming to mobile phones near you in the next 24 months. You'll be able to hold your phone up and look at the world through the phone and see the world with a new layer of reality. Sounds weird, doesn't it? Okay, it's the way I chose to describe it. If, on the other hand, I told you that if you could shake your phone and you look at it and say, oh, there's a tube station over there, it's just telling you something, right? They're the same thing I've told you. One I've just told you in common sense terms, one I've told you in terms of the technology that underpins it. The fact of the matter is, the world is going to change, and before the change, it's very difficult to describe it.
Doug, whether you're the CEO of a major multinational Fortune 500 company or you're the founder of a startup, your job is to identify what the next opportunity or the next major market trend will be. How do you, Doug Richard, identify or keep your finger on the pulse of what's going to be coming up next?
I think you just spend a lot of time, what I do is I ask myself a series of questions over and over on a regular basis as things move forward. What you're talking about is kind of like trend analysis, and I do it all the time. It's not very hard to do. It's like learning how to be creative, right? These things are underused muscles, you got to exercise them. So if you want to do trend analysis constantly, take a very simple everyday thing and ask yourself 6 or 7 questions. I'll give you an example. So there's a restaurant in my neighborhood that I dislike intensely because the first time I ever went there, they had built, if you think about a restaurant is best understood by its menu. Its menu essentially is what somebody has decided that restaurant will be. Yes, there's ambience, yes, there's location, there's all these things, but it's the only thing they can exercise control over is what they serve you, right? And so you can understand restaurants by their menus. And if you think about it, you could do a trend analysis of restaurants and menus. So let's start with sociological trends. Okay, what are sociological trends that attend to food today in restaurants? There's obesity and provenance, I would assert, would probably be the two biggest. Provenance means people are caring more and more about where their food comes from. You know this, otherwise there wouldn't be organics, otherwise there wouldn't be Hugh Ferning, whatever his name, in on Channel 4 weeping over the death of battery-fed chickens as he breaks their neck, right? People care about the source of food and they distrust it. We've got a culture of distrust. Therefore, if I were starting a restaurant today, I would probably let people know where my food came from. And guess what? More and more restaurants are. Why are they doing it? Because they know that their customers want it. What else is going on? We're in a recession, so an economic trend. So what do people do about food in economic recession? Do you happen to know?
They usually order in Domino's pizza. I think that's the reason why Domino's stock's gone up.
That's right. They also tend to retreat to comfort foods. So we all go back to our comfort foods. And I'd be the first to admit, I find British comfort food pretty bizarre. But you would find my comfort food pretty bizarre. I grew up on Kraft macaroni and cheese, which I think is mostly unique because I don't think there's any macaroni or cheese in that product. You know, it's sort of a glowing yellow thing that sits in your plate. But I have very fond memories of that. People in recession retreat to comfort foods. And so if I were starting a restaurant or adapting to survive in a recession, I would probably change my menu to adapt to the taste. Our actual tastes change when we're fearful. Right? The trend analysis. You can predict what people will do reasonably reliably in any situation, in any product, in any industry. The near future is easy to predict. It's what comes beyond the near future that's very awkward.
A lot of people try and go back to what worked or what products and services did well in the last economic recession or the last economic upturn now. Is that a good thing to do, Doug, in your mind? Does it work again?
The past doesn't predict the future at all. You'll misinterpret it. Right? Watching people go from horses to trains would not have predicted much of the societal impact of trains to cars.
Talking about predicting the next big thing on the web, for example, we've obviously had user-generated video content, then we moved into social networks. What do you think the next gigantic thing will be on the horizon?
Most of the trends that we talk about are actually related to very simple concepts, and that is, in a perfect world, what everybody wants is to have the answer to everything on demand, where they are, when they are, for whatever purpose that suits them. And so long as you remember that, most trends fall into place and most innovation falls into place. Therefore, we want to be mobile. Of course we want to be mobile, not because we care about being mobile, but we're usually not tethered to a desktop. Therefore, anything we want, we're going to want on a device that fits in our pocket, which pretty much predicts a lot of what's coming. So anything you may want, you're going to have it on your mobile, which predicts 4G networks. It predicts new changes in silicon design. It predicts handheld form factors. It predicts the forthcoming, not yet admitted tablet by Apple. And it predicts the notion that we would use our hands in intuitive gestures using haptic technology, which is how the iPhone works. Because once again, it's one less obstruction between us and asking and getting what we want. Right? So when people ask, what is Twitter? Twitter itself was merely intended to update people as to what other people were doing, a perfectly inane activity. But it has quickly transformed itself into a tool for real-time information flow. And in fact, that's what it is. It's not a business in itself. It's merely evidence of what comes next. Therefore, if we want social networks, not because they're new, they're not. Social networks existed as long as we've had networks of friends. We want to know what they're up to, and we want them to know what we're up to, right? That's an enabling technology that permits it to happen. Twitter makes it faster. So everything's, whether we like it or not, everything will go real time, as fast as it can. And what comes after everything being real time? I suspect information overload and tools to turn it off.
Doug, Twitter really doesn't have a defined revenue stream at this point in time, and it's quite simplistic in its nature. So do you think that if the founder of Twitter had walked into the dragon's den, that the dragons would have invested in him or kicked the founder of Twitter out without investment?
Okay, so if Twitter had pitched to the dragons, no, it would never have gotten investment. Why? Because the dragons aren't smart enough to predict innovative technology investments as a rule. So as a group, that would be the wrong group to pitch Twitter to. A. B. Justifiably, there were a million other companies just like Twitter you've never heard about that shared Twitter's core weakness, no revenue model, that you haven't heard about because they sucked and failed. So you're picking the exception out of the rule. Now Twitter has levitated because at the right moment in time, it latched onto a key human desire, and that is to know more quickly. And it suited people. It worked. So combination of luck, fortuitous circumstance, and insight by the founders put them in the position they're in. But you said something else. You said, but couldn't somebody else do that? That is true of every software innovation in the world. Somebody else can always do that. It is never a good reason not to invest because somebody else could also innovate. You don't invest because of a defensive strategy. You invest, especially in software where nothing is protectable, you invest because you're doing it. Because after all, they didn't do it, did they? Well, that would be true for Facebook. Anybody could have done that. But they didn't. Google could have done Facebook in a second. It took them 4 years to get Google profiles up and running, and they have a huge advantage. Where were they for 4 years? 4 years. Facebook managed to put 160 million users together, and that's an innovative, fast company. So tell me exactly why I would not invest in companies merely because somebody else could do it.
With the amount of disruptive innovators out there in the marketplace and with the pace of change with India and everything else, with all the trends going on, is it possible to have a truly sustainable competitive advantage? And if so, maybe you can give me an example of one or two.
A sustainable competitive advantage is any situation where the roadblocks are of greater cost than the opportunity, right? So that the follower doesn't want to spend the money to catch up. And that happens all the time, not just in monopolies, but there's lots of companies that have endured. Also, there's other sustainable competitive advantages that are much less tangible. Great customer service is a sustainable competitive advantage. There are companies for which we become very affectionate and that we feel very warm and friendly towards because they have been so good over a period of time at satisfying us. Another sustainable competitive advantage is brand value, right? So the fact of the matter is there are certain brands that are so recognizable that I could show you their logos and you would know exactly who they are. Now they've invested a huge amount of money in that. I mean, a huge amount of money. And they've done so not just with money, but with style, wit, with a clear mission and a purpose. It is very difficult to become recognized by everyone on the globe. That is an unlikely outcome. And yet Coca-Cola and Nike and Apple, each one of them has a logo without a name on it. Apple is an apple with a bite out of it. Nike's a swoosh, and Coca-Cola is a sort of a variable curve of red and white. I could show you any of them, you'd know who they are. I would defy people to point out how you're going to break that competitive advantage.
Doug, a lot of people think that if they've got a great logo, then they have a great brand, which we all know is not the case. But if you wanted, or if somebody wants to create one of those brands that in 20 or 30 years' time, they'll be on the list of the ones that you've just mentioned, and people will look at them with affection, how would you go about actually attaining that level of global status within your brand?
A brand is not a logo, and a brand is not a product. A brand is essentially whatever's left in your mind after the ad's gone away, right? It's your perception of that company. And the easiest way to understand a brand is to think of it as a promise. All brands are implicitly promises. And the companies that achieve successful brands know what the promise is and do a very good job of keeping that promise over and over and over again with almost religious fervor. So take Apple. I would assert that Apple's promise is that they will always be delightful. That their product, they're about product innovation. Because the fact is, they weren't the first MP3 player, right? iPod was gazillionth, who knows? But their products are so good you want to lick them, right? They're beautiful, they're like delightful. Even when they don't work, even when they have less functions, even when their batteries can't even be replaced and sometimes blow up. We forgive Apple all those sins. Why? Because their customer service is better? No. Because they're less pricey? No. But because they're delightful, because they're remarkable, because they deliver a user experience that Steve Jobs has made it his life's mission to own end to end so he can control every single element of it and therefore deliver an experience that works every time in a way no one's ever done before. I know what his promise is, and he's very effective at it.
It's interesting you used the word remarkable, because Seth Godin was talking about
Seth Godin invented the use of the word remarkable in marketing, and you have to give him full credit for it.
It's very true. It's the ability to, basically the ability for people to remark about you, is that correct?
Well, it's word of mouth.
Word of mouth.
What he's really saying is that the essence of effective marketing is understanding it's that people talking to people is the only way in which marketing is ever effective.
Doug, you have a BA from the University of California, Berkeley, in psychology. So could you just tell us, to what extent has your understanding of psychology helped you so far in business and leadership?
I have no idea. I studied psychology because I liked it. I went into business because I liked it. So it's very difficult to know. I think that I'm actually not very good at reading people. So I hire with reluctance. I turn to others to see what others think of others. I tend not to know people till I've worked with them for a while. So I don't actually think that I'm particularly insightful about other people in the individual. Pretty good at predicting groups.
But Doug, when you were on Dragon's Den, it seemed like out of the panel you were always one of the first to identify and tell the person if you thought that their idea or their individual chance of success were good or bad.
I think it's because I have no illusions about the fact that I can read people, and I think many people are under the illusion that they can. The fact of the matter is people like to talk about themselves, people like to talk about what they're interested in, people are more than happy to tell you what they desire, and they cannot stop themselves from hinting at the truth. And so if you ask enough questions, chances are you'll get a pretty good picture despite their best efforts.
Doug, a lot of giant organizations try to recreate the entrepreneurial spirit within their workforce. But if you're Goliath trying to compete against David, is it possible to recreate that level of excitement and that level of drive and entrepreneurial spirit?
The advantage a large corporation has, amongst other things, is reach, capital, staying power. There's nothing wrong with acquiring a good startup. It's very difficult to try to institutionalize entrepreneurship, and I'm not sure it's very desirable. The fact of the matter is, some of the great advantages of a large corporation is that you can be steadfast, you can be regular, you can be systematic, you can drive down costs, you can create an expectable experience. There's a lot of things about a large corporation that are to its advantage. I would certainly take the easy path and work to its natural advantages instead of trying to take 10,000 people and turn them all into a bunch of budding entrepreneurs, when in fact they're working for a large corporation, which suggests that they were looking for security, not risk in the first place.
If you're a market leader, then there's a tendency for complacency to set in because you're already market leader, you're not trying to catch up.
Have you ever been in a race where the other guy wasn't racing with you, and you're going, when you beat him, you're like, your car beats their car across a city block, but they didn't know there was a race? It's not as satisfying as you might think, right? The problem is the big company doesn't even know there's a race on. Yeah. They don't care. You're too small to be visible. The greatest thing that can happen to a startup is for them to notice you long enough to compete with you. Do you have any idea how much free advertising you get if they just compared themselves to you? The fact is, they're large. They don't need to worry about you.
Doug, I know you coach small, aggressive startup organizations, but do you have any advice for those larger, giant organizations as to how they can continue to compete?
Yeah, don't worry about being nimble. Just try to not be so far behind, and you'll probably crush every startup in your path. You don't have to be first. You just have to get it right. A large corporation that watches what startups do, and they can't help doing it, and then sees what works, and then implements it in a methodical way for its own customer base, doesn't even have to do everything. Just has to do enough to keep them from defecting.
Doug, one of your mantras for winning organizations is to make sure you're always leveraged, whether you're a small organization or a large organization. So what do you mean by that?
I mean that if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to be short of resources, full stop. And your entire goal in life is to juggle more balls than you got hands, right? And so leverage is about finding others you can take intentional advantage of who receive enough benefit for it that it gives you stretch and reach beyond your means. That's partners, that's distributors, that's stakeholders in every direction. Leverage is persuading others to come along for the ride. That could be persuading somebody else to take on your products, persuading somebody else to sell for you. For example, I was working with a young startup last week, and they were talking about signing on what amounted to distributors for their software solution. And they were saying, well, our software distributors, they're going to have to create a certain number of leads and a certain number of sales in a certain period of time, or we're not going to then award them more leads. And I said, no, you've got it backwards. What you should do is award them more leads than they can handle. Because as a distributor, they have more than one product to sell. And if you take up so much of their time with so many leads that they have no time for anything else, you're essentially borrowing somebody else's sales force at no cost to you without them ever intending for you to have done that. So what you should do is you should flood them with leads as soon as you meet them and let them find themselves feeling quite inadequate to take on the task, because they'll simply put more and more resources against it and you'll have a free sales force at your beck and call. So it's not a test, it's a persuasion.
And you can get leverage when you hire great people as well, right? But you just need to make sure that you allow them to get on with it, because a lot of entrepreneurs are very controlling.
I think you have to be profoundly lazy to be successful. I think too many people want to do too much work and they want to have too much control. Work, nobody's going to go onto their deathbed saying, thank God I worked the whole time, right? Thank God I met that last meeting. Thank God I wrote that PowerPoint. At the end of the day, work is not the goal. Outcomes are the goal. If you can do them in a minute, why take 8 hours? If you can have somebody else do it and do a fantastic job, why are you looking over their shoulders? That's 2 people doing one person's job. So yes, that's leverage. I don't really like employing people. So my theory is, if I can hire one very, very bright person, why hire 5 people who are less effective? That's less people to manage. It's less complexity. It's just less everything.
Yeah, because some people, Doug, are genuinely proud of the fact that their competitive advantage is their ability to work insanely long hours. Whereas in actual fact, maybe their competitive advantage would be much better to work fewer hours, but think a lot smarter.
People who brag about how busy they are, people who don't have time to return their emails or their phone calls, people who are always rushing from one meeting to another or taking a BlackBerry during a meeting or a meeting during the BlackBerry, they're just demonstrating to me their incapacity to succeed. So I don't know what they're proving, but they're not proving a great deal to me.
Intelligent laziness is obviously an important characteristic. So is it something that you are able to identify as to whether they have or haven't got it before you make an investment? Can you probe for it in conversation?
I'm not sure there's any way to probe for it. And so when I talk to entrepreneurs about taking angel investment, for example, I encourage them to tell the angel, why don't we work together for a few months? And have the angel investor basically give their time for free. As an angel investor, I, as a rule, will work with a company for months before I invest, for the simple reason that, like I've said before, the truth always comes out. You hang out with somebody long enough, you'll get the measure of them. I work with somebody for a while, they can't help themselves, can they? So in due course, it'll come out. And you know what? I never understood what the rush was. Every entrepreneur thinks they need more money more quickly than they do. Well, they're going to waste half it, so why don't you just wait 6 months, then you'll have to put half of it in.
Doug, as an investor in many startups, with so much mess and noise that goes on in startups, how do you make sure that they are aligned towards the goals and targets that they should be aligned to in order to get great outputs?
I think you start by keeping things very, very simple so that everyone understands what the specific goal is. I think nothing should be treated as a metaphor. If you have a goal, it should be tangible, countable, repeatable, knowable. Everyone should know what it is. It should be very concrete. A. B. Everyone needs to know what they need to do, what their contribution is, so that the goal is reached. Everyone needs to know that their responsibility doesn't end when they hand it to the next person. Their responsibility ends when we reach the goal. So it is never an excuse in my mind for someone to come to me and say, well, I handed it off to them, it was their turn. Hey, if we didn't reach the goal, we failed. So we all own it until it's done.
Doug, what would be the #1 rule that you would suggest that entrepreneurs absolutely abide by?
The first day of School for Startups is entitled The 6 Rules for Startups. And the first rule is make something people want. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Except that many people will come to me with ideas and they'll say, I've got this. And I'll say, well, how do we know people want it? They'll say, well, because they should, or they will, or my friends have told me they all love it. But how do we know they'll want it? You have to kind of go out and figure it out, don't you? You have to find out a problem. You have to solve a pain. You have to scratch an itch. You actually have to talk to people and let them talk to you. I encourage people, if you're going to build a great product, to go out and talk to prospective customers and ask questions. Endless, non-stop, heroic quantities of questions. And ultimately, the truth will come out.
It's
You notice I tend to say the same answer to all problems.
That's good. Get out there in the marketplace and make sure there actually is a demand and a need. It's not in the head.
Or even a positive response, right? If it's something new, you're going to have to paint a picture for a world that hasn't existed and see if you can get inside their heads enough so that they can envision what it would be like with it in their lives instead of not with it in their lives, so that you can see whether or not their response is positive or not. Because you're going to have to do it once you have the product, aren't you?
Yeah. Doug, on your School for Startups, you talk about how people or organizations can get massive marketing exposure but with zero expenditure. So can you elaborate on how organizations can do that?
The key elements of marketing require time, not money. And what people misunderstand about marketing, well, people misunderstand a lot of things, but the core goal of marketing is nothing more or less than to take people who should want your product, prospective suspects, as it were, prospective customers who haven't indicated desire, and to make them aware of your product in such a way so that they express the desire. The fastest and the easiest way to do that is not to go out and find people who should want it, but to wait for people to become prospects and then to intercept them on the way to sale, right? So, because if somebody has already expressed interest in what you want, you've saved a whole step. So so it becomes inbound marketing rather than outbound. Best way to do that is to wait for somebody to search for it. That's why Google's so important, because for the first time in history, people are expressing their desire before you have to do anything, and thus you can know what they want. That's why SEO is so critical. That's why an organic search result is more important than a paid result. Organic search results cost nothing. It's not cash. It's creativity and it's effort. It's a hugely democratizing principle that lets very small companies play on a much more even playing field than ever before.
Doug, can you explain to us why the whole philosophy behind search and search engine optimization is so important for marketeers today?
SEO, in large part, is the act of creating content elsewhere that points back to you as the solution. That means writing, videoing, audioing, getting yourself out into the world in lots and lots of other places. It is the creation of content out in the world that talks about what you're doing, talks about you and your business, that pushes back towards you. It is very low cost, if not free, and it is the underlying point of the equality of the web. I mean, what stops you from doing more, writing more, and talking more?
Doug, phenomenal content. Thank you very much indeed for your time today, sir. It's very much appreciated.
You're welcome.
Bevo